everybody, Nick Smith with JB&A. I'm sitting down with Mark from Seagate to talk about storage technology. Now, as you all know, Seagate produces a lot of different storage, from the hard drives to the chassis, and all those kind of fit in different models, whether it be a NAS, a SAN, an object, whatever. So we're going to talk about the whatever for a couple minutes and try and help you demystify what might be the right platform for you to consider. You ready for this?
Absolutely.
It's going to be like the acronym game.
Perfect.
Yeah, okay. So
Perfect. Fire away.
First off, let's talk RAID. What is RAID, effectively?
So RAID stands for, you know what RAID stands for?
Redundant.
Redundant array of,
independent disks,
yeah,
right?
though actually originally it was inexpensive disks.
Oh, even better.
Because the idea was it was taking you're basically taking multiple drives and putting them together for a purpose, whether performance or protection or both.
It's interesting. We've been hiring a lot of younger, fresh college graduates. And so many of them coming out of the computer science industry are focused on the software, and then we put hardware in front of them, and they kind of freak out, like, whoa, what is that? That exists? It's quite interesting. So RAID effectively is what we say, we don't get the performance of one disk, we get the performance of multiple disks, giving us more throughput, faster access to the media, kind of, going all the way through.
Exactly, but it's also more on you can think of it on I want to say system level, or all the drives are working together as a system. Literally, like if you're doing a RAID scheme that has protection, parity, we call it, and that's a whole other topic we should probably talk about, is data protection. But it's all kind of baked together. So which is why when you have to do a rebuild of a RAID,
it takes forever.
Because so even if I'm only using 5% of that RAID, like if I'm only consuming 5% of the total capacity, I still have to rewrite, and I've replaced a disk, I have to rewrite every block of data on that disk I replaced, even if I'm only using 5%. And
that's traditionally the only time you end up, you do it once when you build the initial volume.
Correct.
And then if you have to replace a bad disk, those, and which kind of brings us into where Core Vault leads us, and why people would consider that. We'll come back around to that one.
Yeah, or erasure coding generally, right?
Or erasure coding in general, yeah. Which is, and I think oftentimes you guys have sort of broken what we traditionally think of as erasure coding, because traditionally people pin it only into cloud-based technology. You're doing it different. We'll come into that. So we've got the RAID. RAID is a fundamental to SANs and NASs, effectively. So SAN being a storage area network, and a NAS being a network accessible storage, right? So these two kind of platforms. When do people choose one or the other? Because they both fundamentally give you the same thing: fast storage, access via cable, right?
Well, and especially now as IP-based networks have gotten so much faster. You have 100 gig networks as really commonplace now. And you can also, you have certain file systems and I want to say, software companies doing the file systems that have created really fast protocols that eliminate the latency that you normally associate with all the packetizing of the data.
Because honestly, if we go back, say, 10, 15 years, SANs were performance-based solutions, NASs were accessibility-based solutions. Everybody can see it, versus the SAN, you had to have a very special cable.
And essentially that's at a base level because of the way that things connect. With the SAN, every host or every computer, every client of the SAN is literally directly connected to the storage. Essentially has a direct pipe to the storage.
Direct to the disk,
And then you have a separate metadata network sitting on top of it that is just like that same network that the NAS would be connected to, where data is packetized, and that's, get back to there in a second, but out of band, you have a traffic cop that's basically monitoring all the traffic going, that each separate user is hitting the hard drives with to make sure that nothing's overlapping. But you get a direct, fast connection, which is why SANs were always the way to go for editing and
But as you said, the network performance has come up to a level now where we're very close to parity, if not sometimes even, I would say now exceeding.
In some cases.
With these new 50 gig, 100 gig, 200 gig pipelines.
Well, in raw performance, yes. But again, keep in mind that with NAS, you're packetizing the data. So that everyone can share it. You're basically, all the data gets cut down into these little pieces and sent across the pipes, and then get reassembled on the other end.
Becoming more processor intensive at that point.
Right.
Now, do you think SANs are going away?
Long term, Probably.
Yeah.
I mean, I take it back. There are certain processes maybe where they make sense. I think more likely we're probably going to see fiber channel go away sooner than later.
iSCSI over Ethernet, or fiber over Ethernet.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. I mean, probably CI and more in specialized workloads. I would say in media and entertainment specifically, I expect to see really NAS take over. NAS protocols take over.
I still see a place for it oftentimes inside the data center where we have sort of clustered data,
Exactly.
where specific service applications are looking at this data and they're kind of the end all. And then at the periphery or at the edge of this, we have people connecting over like NAS interfaces effectively. But I think it's definitely shrinking from that perspective.
But that's where I expect, at least my expectation is that longer term in those little clusters you talk about in data centers, that you'll see it move to iSCSI.
Yep.
As opposed to...
So the next iteration of this, when we're looking at, direct attach to SAN to NAS to, these are fundamentally all built on RAID.
Yep.
We then move to object store.
Yep.
Which is not built on RAID.
Correct.
It's built on, as you mentioned earlier, erasure coding.
Right. Well, we really need to separate object store from erasure coding.
True.
Because erasure coding is the data protection scheme. Just like RAID is.
Yep.
And you can think of it as an alternative to RAID. And there are different folks who've had other, similar erasure coding based schemes. But essentially, whether you're talking about traditional RAID or you're talking about erasure coding, what you're ultimately doing is you're taking the data or the system and you're throwing math in to essentially...
My worst subject in school, but go
right,
on.
yeah, but we're doing algebra, or the system is doing high level algebra, way higher than my level of algebra, but so that it essentially creates parity, which is the result of an equation. So it basically takes a piece of data, splits it up into pieces, and then says, x plus y plus z equals q, and then that q is my parity that I then store on the disk as well, so that if I'm missing any one of those components, I can look at the result and figure out the missing component. Yeah. The difference, at least the way I like to think about it, is the difference between RAID and erasure coding is RAID is done at a system level. So all the drives, essentially all that parity is written in at the beginning, or it's all baked, the system is baked in together so that this block and this block and this block all, the parity block is over here, whether or not I've written anything to it. With erasure coding, you're doing all those operations on the data directly. So all it looks at is available space, and I've got all these devices that all have available space on them. So I need to take this piece of data and split it up into 16 different pieces, or however many. It depends on the erasure coding scheme you're using.
The schema they want. Yep.
But I need to split it up into X number of pieces, and I need X number of pieces of parity so I can lose those numbers.
Which is, and this is that space where we look at when we lose a drive in RAID, we lose not just capacity, but we also lose performance.
Yep. Because
we don't have as many disks. But when we lose a drive in erasure coding, we're not losing performance.
Well, you'll lose a minimal. I mean, it'll depend on it'll really just depend on the number of disks in the disk group. So you lose theoretically, some amount of performance, but it's usually negligible especially compared to the performance you lose in RAID. Because with RAID, you don't, because of the time involved in rebuilds and there are kind of upper limits with each RAID level of number of disks you would have in a RAID group. With RAID 5, I typically wouldn't recommend more than 6 or 8 at the very most drives in that disk group. With RAID 6, that maybe you go up to 14, right. Something like that. But you typically, practically don't want to go beyond a certain number of drives in that RAID group because of the likelihood increasing statistically of a drive failure or an issue. And then when you do have that drive failure, especially as we've now gotten into larger and larger drives, how long it takes to do that rebuild. It's going to take
longer to build it,
Yeah.
Now in RAID, we have the process of building the array, right? And we have a RAID card that's managing the array.
Yep.
What does that look like in erasure-coded appliances? Is there a RAID card there? Are they JBODs, effectively? What does it look like?
So there is some compute involved. Now, in the case of our systems, we're ASIC-based. So it's basically a very specialized processor.
System on a chip.
Right, exactly. System on a chip. So it's doing all the math. Where traditionally you would have a lot of compute involved. You would have some kind of standard microprocessor that was doing all the same math that you'd be doing otherwise.
So, okay, so let's now move to the other end of the spectrum, because we started on the erasure coding, how erasure coding can replace RAID, can kind of fit in the space, or replace SAN. Where does it fit in the cloud environment, and what is different about cloud?
Right, so you mentioned object storage. Object storage kind of by default was built on erasure coding. Object storage, the difference is essentially, rather than having a file system where literally there's a strict hierarchy in terms of the data, in object storage, everything, all of the data, the metadata goes with the data, and it all gets stored in a location, essentially like an IP. It's like an IP address.
Or in the case of how we've sort of come to know it, is a bucket.
Yep. Exactly.
It's like, here's my bucket, I dump my data inside it.
Yep. And I'm looking for this little piece in that bucket that has its own little location or address.
And that allows us to scale out, because that bucket can grow. They're not defined by LUNs and volumes and all that. They're effectively just disk. Right, and the data can get spread across those disks. And this has lent it to why cloud storage is kind of built, because it allows you to scale almost infinitely. Right, and just continue to create larger and larger buckets. Which is very different. But there are performance losses and gains in doing this. Right, so you would not take an object store and say that's going to be my editorial platform. Right, because you have to reconstruct the data every time you retrieve it.
Correct.
Right, and pull all the little pieces together. Whereas in our NASs and our SANs, they're ready to go. So really, I think part of this is to help people understand, like, when we're structuring our roadmap for storage, and we talked in a previous episode about when to use cloud and why you would tier. This is sort of part of that process, that I would choose a SAN or a NAS as my tier 1 and possibly my tier 2, and then look at cloud as my tier 3. I would have my place to edit, my place to rest, and my place to archive, so to speak. And just help kind of put the bigger picture together.
Absolutely, absolutely. And by the way, and just to throw a little more complication in there, we now even have players who take that object storage in the cloud and essentially put a virtual NAS on top of it so that you can edit in the cloud.
Which we're in the process of testing right now. It's very beautiful stuff. So no, there's some great things happening in this space right now. It's fun to look at the storage industry from the outside. But awesome. Thanks for your time.
My pleasure.
We'll see you all next time.